On the 13th of August, 1981, 23-year-old Vincenzo Maniscalco wandered the Hamburg Dom summer market and fun fair, looking for something to pass the time until his wife finished work. One fairground ride in particular caught his eye, the Skylab. The ride attendants were addressing the crowd, shouting that they were about to begin the last ride of the night. Without a second thought, Vincenzo purchased a ticket. He did it anticipating only that it would be a way to pass a few minutes while he waited. But this ride would end up changing his life, and the lives of dozens of other people at the Dom that evening, forever. As early as the 1300s, a winter festival was held in the city of Hamburg in Germany. Each year, dozens of traders would set up market stalls and entertainments in St. Mary's Cathedral in the city. The building would provide them with shelter and allow them to go on trading through harsh winters. By the time the cathedral was eventually demolished in the early 1800s, the fairs had become so popular that they simply had to continue. For several years, merchants tried out different locations around Hamburg before settling on a permanent home, the large open space of Heiligengeistfeld Public Square. Despite this new location, the fair retained the name it had always had, a name which referenced the cathedral that no longer existed, Hamburg Dom, which translates to Hamburg Cathedral. Tourists who might visit expecting to see a grand, ancient stone building may be confused to find instead only a busy market in a public square surrounded by several municipal buildings. The most cathedral-like structure is an old flak tower that was installed during World War II. 3 times a year, however, Heiligengeistfeld comes to life with one of the largest seasonal markets in the north of Germany. At each event, you'll find not just traders and food vendors, but multiple bars, ice skating, games, and live music. By the 1980s, a traveling fun fair was a regular part of this long-running market. The fair included several rides, from simple family-friendly carousels to more intense roller coasters and drop towers. The rides were collected in one area of the market, but were managed by different operators. One of these operators was Norbert Witte. At 26 years old, he had been raised in a family of entertainers and had spent his life around traveling fun fairs. Even at a young age, he had developed a reputation as an enthusiastic and ambitious showman. He and several employees were overseeing the running of one of the most thrilling rides available that night, the Katapult, a short looping roller coaster with rapid acceleration that would launch guests from 0 to 80 miles or 128 kilometers per hour in just 4 seconds. However, during the day there had been some technical problems with this star attraction. The gearbox was malfunctioning. Norbert waited until the fun fair was beginning to close down, and then went to fetch a truck-mounted telescopic crane. He drove this into position behind the catapult, extended the arm, and with the help of his employees, lifted the gearbox out of position and deposited it on the ground for maintenance. He then left the crane. He would need to use it again to return the gearbox to the ride, and saw no reason to retract the arm. It remained at full extension, sticking up at an angle almost 3 stories into the air. Meanwhile, next door to the catapult, staff managing the Skylab ride were preparing for the final run of the evening. The Skylab was a type of ride that is more commonly known as the Enterprise. It consists of a number of cages dangling from the perimeter of a wheel. When the ride begins, the wheel rotates, picking up speed until the gondolas are almost horizontal to the ground below. A hydraulic arm then raises the wheel until the gondolas are flying along a nearly vertical circular path. These rides often feature very little by way of restraints, as the gondolas are enclosed. It is impossible to fall out during normal operation, and in any event, the forces which act on the riders usually keep them pressed back securely into their seats. As midnight approached, Skylab ride attendants loaded guests into each of the gondolas and secured the doors. Most gondolas contained 1 guest each, but in some cases, couples or parents with children chose to ride together. Once the ride was full, staff began its cycle. The first part of the ride went smoothly. The gondolas picked up speed, and the hydraulic arm began to rise. Nobody at this stage had noticed that the head of Norbert's telescopic crane was dangerously close to the path of the Skylab. As the angle of the hydraulic arm increased, the gondolas flew closer and closer to the abandoned crane. The impact, when it happened, caused the whole ride to shake and rattle. Abruptly, screams of exhilaration became screams of pain and terror. One after another, the gondolas smashed into the arm of the crane, which ripped easily through the lower parts of the gondolas. In several cases, this impact alone was enough to cause horrific injury to the guests within, but it also opened up several gondolas. With the floor ripped away by the crane, guests were thrown from the ride, tumbling down to the concrete below. The Skylab was brought to an emergency stop just moments after the collision, but the damage had already been done. The ground below was strewn with the twisted remains of several gondolas and the bodies of the guests who had fallen from them. In total, 7 people died as a result of the accident, and a further 16 people were injured, some seriously. Police attended and closed down the funfair. Among the witnesses who gave evidence at this trial were several people who had survived the disaster. One of them was 23-year-old Vincenzo Maniscalco, who escaped with only minor injuries. Vincenzo had not originally intended to ride the Skylab. Instead, he had come to the Dom to pick up his wife, who was working on one of the concession stands. While he waited for her to finish work, he wandered the fairground and looked over some market stalls. The staff of the Skylab caught his attention by shouting that they were about to run the ride for the last time that day. On a whim, Vincenzo paid 2.5 marks for a ticket and climbed on board. When the collision with the crane took place, Vincenzo's gondola was almost completely destroyed, with most of the lowermost part of it ripped away by the impact. Vincenzo survived by bracing himself against the bars on either side and drawing his legs up towards his body. He later said that he believed if he had not done so, he would have lost his legs in the disaster. The whole experience was terrifying and traumatizing, but Vincenzo nonetheless relived it when he served as a witness during the trial. Ultimately, his testimony proved vital because of one tiny, specific detail. Norbert Witte's defense was to blame the operators of the Skylab. The woman in charge, he claimed, had been drunk at the time of the accident. It had been he, Norbert, who had run into the Skylab operations cabin and hit the emergency stop, he insisted. But it should never have been necessary, for it was after 1 in the morning when the accident took place, and the Skylab was not allowed to operate after 1 in the morning. That was, said Norbert, the only reason he had fetched the telescopic crane in the first place. The Skylab should have been shut for the night. The disaster was, Norbert said, due to a decision taken by Skylab ride attendants to reopen their attraction for one last ride after the time when it should have ceased operation altogether. It was here that Vincenzo's testimony came in. While waiting for the ride to begin, he had become anxious about keeping his wife waiting when she finished work, and so had checked his watch and made a note of the time. When the ride began moving, it was 12:54. 6 minutes before 1 in the morning. The Skylab had been operating during its normal, scheduled, and permitted hours.